Good day, and thank you for the opportunity to speak today concerning an issue that I have wrestled with over the last decade of my career. As I began my training in pediatrics and neonatology in 1974, the most authoritative textbook, Schaefer and Avery's Diseases of the Newborn, published in 1971, estimated the limit of viability to be around 28 weeks gestation and/or 1,000 grams. I must say, based on my experience in those early days, that limit appeared to be quite true. Even at 28 weeks, working with the old baby bird ventilators, which were quite new at the time, we were blowing out lungs left and right, and if an infant survived the traumatic experience, it seemed quite miraculous. Nevertheless, progress has been made with the advent of much more sophisticated ventilatory machines, the use of non-invasive ventilatory strategies, the use of surfactant, and improved nutritional strategies. In most tertiary care centers in the United States today, there's little hesitation to intervene with resuscitation of the 24-week gestation fetus, and the outcomes are for the most part good. Yet hovering on the brink of viability at 22 to 23 weeks gestation is the untimely birth of a fetus that poses great angst to those involved in the potential care of these periviable fetuses. Whether to intervene or not has become an issue not only for the medical community, but also for the public at large. My objectives today are to briefly review public perception of intervening to save periviable fetuses 20 to 24 weeks gestation, to review the number of periviable fetuses born in the United States from 2017 to 2024, to review the percentage which receive resuscitation efforts, and to review their percentage survival. And finally, to review the ethical dilemmas associated with attempting to intervene with advanced technology at the limit of viability, and wondering whether there will ever be a point where the moral imperative to not intervene will overrule the technological imperative to intervene. A year ago now, in August of 2024, an article appeared in the Wall Street Journal stating, quote, that doctors can now save very premature babies, but most hospitals don't try. The article states, quote, babies born 22 weeks into pregnancy have increasingly better odds of survival, but parents often don't know what's possible, end of quote. The implication of the title seems to be that most hospitals willingly refrain from providing care to these extremely preterm periviable infants. The article reports several heartbreaking examples of women who went to hospitals unable to provide the highly specialized care required in attempting to keep these babies alive, and allowed the mothers to deliver without attempting to resuscitate the infant, or they denied transfer. Truly heartbreaking, but the reality is the technical challenges of working with these infants at the current limits of viability, as well as the cost and morbidity if they survive, and the financial costs are not insignificant. Although the article goes on to quote several physicians who suggest their success rate for keeping babies at this gestation alive long enough to go home from the hospital is 60%, the article also quotes several doctors who suggest that the costs both in morbidity and finances are too great to justify routine attempts to save these babies. Nevertheless, the article closes with the agonizing losses expressed by several women, suggesting that care of infants this small has become a routine standard of care. A follow-up article appeared in the Wall Street Journal in July of this year, noting Senate Bill 2433, the Neonatal Care Transparency Act of 2025, that had been introduced by Senator Tom Cotton. This bill, stimulated by the previous Wall Street Journal article, would require providers to disclose policies regarding the minimum gestational age at which life-saving care would be provided to an infant in the case of premature birth. As of today, the bill is still in the Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. According to the article, some hospitals, such as Children's Hospital in Minneapolis, the University of Iowa in Iowa City, Iowa, or the USA Health Children's and Women's Hospital in Mobile, Alabama, have successfully treated most infants they have cared for in recent years born at 22 weeks gestational age. Thus, the public, by way of at least this article, is given the perception that the limit of viability could be as low as 22 weeks gestation. The question, then, is what is the general reported experience of the United States in the occurrence of these periviable fetuses at 20 to 24 weeks gestation, and does it concur with the optimistic experience of the sophisticated academic centers above? Over the next several slides, I would like to report to you U.S. vital statistics data reviewing the absolute number of reported live births by gestational ages from 20 to 24 weeks, the percentage of those births by gestational age admitted to a NICU, the absolute number of those births admitted to the NICU, and the percent survival of those admitted. In this first slide of the absolute number of births by gestational age, note that the lower x-axis reviews births by 10-year intervals from 1990 to 2020, then by yearly intervals from 2020 to 2024, the year 2024 provisional data. As demonstrated in the graph, the absolute number of births since 1990 to 2024, despite some up and down activity, remains about the same for the 24-week gestation group at around 3,000 births and at about 2,500 for the 23-week gestation group. The absolute number of live births from 22 weeks to 20 weeks have decreased over time. This slide reports the percentage of live births admitted to a NICU over the period from 2017 through 2023, the most recent year for which final data are available. The year 2017 marks the year in which the expanded birth certificate data that includes detailed information such as NICU admission became available. As seen in this graph, at 24 weeks gestation since 2017, about 90% are admitted to NICU. At 23 weeks gestation, there's been a slight increase from 75% to 83%. Then a major gap at 22 weeks, when in 2017, only 30% were admitted to the NICU, with a marked increase to 56% in 2023. Certainly, those live births at 21 and 20 weeks represent a major stumbling block to intervention, with NICU admissions percentages of 9.8% in 2017 for the 21-week fetuses, rising to 12% in 2023, and 5.8% in 2017 for the 20-week fetuses, rising to 8.2% in 2023. This slide reports the absolute number of births by gestational age admitted to the NICU. Interestingly, the absolute number of 24-week gestation fetuses has declined over time from 3,000 to about 2,800 in 2023. The absolute number at 23 weeks has remained about the same at a little over 2,000, while the absolute number of 22-week gestation fetuses has almost doubled from 536 to 926. The absolute number of 21 and 22-week fetuses admitted to NICU remains relatively low, with little change. This, I believe, is an important issue to consider because of the cost of care of these periviable fetuses. Based on our experience at the University of Texas Medical Branch, as well as information in the literature, the cost of initial hospital care for the 24-week gestation fetus runs on average about $500,000, and that of 23-week gestation fetuses may run over $1 million. Thus, based on the absolute number of 24-week gestation fetuses in the United States, the cost may be up to $1.2 billion, while the cost of care of 23-week gestation fetuses may be up to $2.1 billion. For the time being, we in the United States seem to be able to forge ahead without much concern for the financial implications of this costly care. Nevertheless, from a social justice perspective, will we be called to task for this undertaking? Of course, here is the money slide. That is the report of percent survival for those infants admitted to the NICU from 2017 to 2023. At 24 weeks, the percent survival has remained relatively steady over this period at about 70%. The same can be said for the 23-week fetuses, running from 55 to 57%. The obvious change has been amongst the 22-week gestation fetuses, with an increase from 32% survival to almost 42% survival. I would argue that as much as anything, this is a reflection of the marked increase in the percentage of these births admitted to NICU. Thus, attempts at intervention at this gestation have increased, resulting in improved survival, not necessarily as a result of improved technology and care over this relatively short period. What to say about the survival of 21 and 20-week gestation fetuses, other than the percent survival is all over the place and is represented by 145 fetuses in the 21-week gestation group in 2023, of which 25 survived, and 78 fetuses in the 20-week gestation group, of which 9 survived. In addition, the likelihood of miscalculation of gestational age in this group seems high, making these estimates unreliable. This slide is put forward as a validity check on the U.S. vital statistics data. The Vermont-Oxford network is composed of 636 U.S. hospitals and reported survival data of 22 to 25-week gestation fetuses from the period 2020 to 2022. The percent survival of the 24 and 23-week gestation infants is almost exactly the same as the U.S. vital statistics data, while the U.S. vital statistics data reports a slightly higher 22-week survival rate of 37.4% in 2022 compared to the Vermont-Oxford rate of 24.9%. Of course, the other issue is not just survival, but what of morbidity associated with the survival. I direct your attention to the right side of the graph with the brown bars. Information from the NICHD Neonatal Network for the period 2013 to 2018 reports for 20-22 weeks gestation only about 10% survived without or with mild neurodevelopmental impairment, about 18% at 23 weeks, and 25 to 30% at 24 weeks gestation. Thus, survival without impairment is a major issue in alerting parents to the risk associated with intervening at these early stages of gestation. Based on what I have shown you now, I conclude the following. In the ensuing 50-plus years since I started in neonatology, the limit of viability has been pushed down to 22 to 23 weeks gestation. This new limit is viewed by some as an opportunity to, quote, do more research in fine-tuning the care of these infants, end of quote. Ethical arguments for and against resuscitation of these small infants range from individualizing probability calculations to determining the likelihood of survival to utilizing cost-benefit analyses to attempt to justify resuscitation. There are some who argue against intervening in the lives of these infants, suggesting that resuscitation of these immature fetuses is simply a means for a caretaker's self-aggrandizement in creating life rather than in rescuing a life in jeopardy. Regardless of the development of improved individual probability estimates for survival at 23 weeks or less, the decision, at least at this point, to take the risk of committing to care for these babies is a value judgment on the part of primarily the parents. Some hospitals, because of cost considerations, will not elect to care for these babies. Others, primarily academic centers who are ever pushing the forefront of technology to improve the care of these infants, will to continue to pursue the magic bullet. But it is ultimately parents who will, in conjunction with physicians, make the value judgment of whether to pursue attempting to intervene and support the life of these very small babies. Some families will say a 10% chance is enough. Others will require a greater probability of survival and survival without significant impairment before making the commitment to enter into the drama of trying to keep one of these small babies alive. And the efforts required to do so are dramatic and require commitment to endure the ups and downs associated with usually at least 4 months of hospital stay. And despite how well physicians may attempt to prepare families for the issues associated with caring for these small infants, how well parents truly hear and understand the implications as they begin the journey is quite questionable. As demonstrated in the empiric data I provided over time, the limit of viability has continued to decrease and in all likelihood will continue to do so. How then to approach the moral and ethical dilemma of whether or not to intervene and attempt to save these more and more immature infants? As the philosophy of medicine changes over time through hypothetical logical propositions of how to improve the likelihood of survival of these small babies, through testing of new technical innovations and empirical science, and then through the synthesis, interpretation, and integration of this information into an understanding of the likelihood of survival of these babies, and the sharing of that synthesis of information with caregivers and parents, the inevitability of attempts to push the limits of viability will continue. Nevertheless, there will be those who elect not to pursue those limits. In the end, the decision of whether or not to intervene comes down to a value judgment of whether to forego resuscitation and accept a humane death, or to resuscitate and risk a compromised life. That is the tragedy of the conflict of two acceptable choices. Still, the scientific and technological imperative is a powerful force and has resulted in amazing advances in medicine. In the care of infants, as discussed, the limit of viability has been pushed back about a decade since the modern introduction of neonatal intensive care. Yet at what cost? The moral imperative of what is the right thing to do seems to normalize to whatever the technology can provide. And on the horizon is the beginning of attempts to maintain these periviable fetuses in an artificial womb or placenta. Work on this technology began over 60 years ago and now has progressed to the point where, after successful attempts to maintain lamb fetuses for periods of times in these environments, human trials are now being considered. The ethics of how informed consent is obtained from vulnerable women desperate to save their periviable fetuses is challenging at best. How physicians explain these trials as experiments or as life-saving technology will certainly bias the decisions of the women involved. Can physicians be truthful as they move to introduce this technology? DeBee and Freudner, who are involved in the development of the artificial womb, provided a thorough review of the ethical considerations in implementing this technology. Their table presented here categorizes fetal development into domains associated with periods of gestation. Domain 1 includes the period fertilization and implantation from 0 to 14 days. Domain 2, embryological and early fetal development, 2 weeks to 21 weeks. Domain 3, periviability, 22 to 25 weeks. And Domain 4, vulnerable prematurity, 26 to 34 weeks. In the table for each domain, they present a rationale for the upper age limit of that domain, current medical support available, and current experimental support. Their rationale for doing so was to nip in the bud critiques of their technology as a means for pursuing complete ectogenesis, that is, the entire process from conception to birth occurring outside of a human body. Their ethical concerns addressed in their review thus deal with Domain 3, issues from 22 to 25 weeks gestation. Their review incorporates the principalist ethics developed in the 1970s by Beauchamp and Childress, addressing autonomy, beneficence, non-malfeasance, and justice. The author's review concerns for all the parties involved, from the feto-neonate, their nomenclature for the periviable fetus, to the parents and to society as a whole. Briefly, they examine potential benefits and harms to the feto-neonate, the parents and society, and autonomy issues of the parents and feto-neonate. As well, they examine social justice issues and the issue of informed consent as an autonomy issue for the parents. Apologies for flying through this so quickly, but hopefully you get the idea. Still, why is it that we pursue attempts to preserve life at sometimes very high cost and with no assurances of a positive outcome? Religious as well as secular arguments provide rationale for valuing human life. Thus, human life is sacred both from a religious and secular perspective. Nevertheless, is there a point in development that differentiates human from non-human nascent life? That point being the point at which the moral imperative to implement technology to preserve and foster nascent life can, should, or ought to be attempted. According to Daniel Callahan, a philosopher and prominent figure in the bioethical movements in the late 60s and early 70s, quote, to be human must take into account the interaction of biological, psychological, read mind, and cultural factors, end of quote. Merely defining human life as a biological phenomenon independent of the mind and cultural milieu in which it occurs as moral justification for the promotion of nascent life seems problematic. Thus, the implementation of technology merely to support biological life is morally problematic. How to morally justify the technology to promote the biologic phenomena of nascent life with the appropriate attention to the state of the mind and the cultural milieu within which it occurs remains the challenge. Consideration must be addressed to the human issues of implementing technology for supporting younger and more immature fetuses. The impact of supporting fetuses in an artificial environment may well have significant psychological and cultural effects for which we cannot predict. The vision of raising in vitro conceived embryos in an artificial environment to harvesting at gestational extra-environmental viable ages, though far-fetched at this time, is a much more tenable idea today than it was when Aldous Huxley wrote his dystopian novel Brave New World, published in 1934, in which reproduction occurred from conception to birth in an artificial environment. As a human species, it would behoove us to make conscious moral decisions as to whether to proceed with technology to achieve the capability of promoting nascent life in an artificial environment before the technology is implemented and the ethical, moral issues simply normalized to the technology available. There is precedent for limiting experimentation on nascent life. The United Kingdom adopted the Human Fertilization and Embryology Act of 1990, limiting experimenting on human embryos conceived by in vitro fertilization to 14 days. For the most part, this act has been adopted as an international guideline. Nevertheless, the scientific technological imperative is strong, and attempts to pursue and push this boundary are ongoing. The moral status of embryos at 14 days for the scientific community appears to be such that, other than a collection of cells, it has no status. Certainly, certain members of the public have other perceptions. Whatever the outcome, I am resigned to the conclusion that the limits of viability will continue to be pushed lower and lower over time as technology advances. I must say I am quite conflicted about this, and am glad I will no longer have to help make those difficult clinical decisions. Thus I retire to my monastic cell and pray for sanity and the sanctity of human life.